Zixthara stared at the datapad in his four-fingered hands and felt something close to boredom settle in his chest. Another monitoring assignment. Another primitive species to observe as they stumbled through their first real battle and inevitably failed. The Valani had been doing this for centuries now, watching new civilizations rise and fall with the cold detachment that made them valuable to the Galactic Defense Council. The briefing room on Station Velkron was nearly empty. Only Zixthara and his commanding officer General Veltar remained, the pale blue lighting casting long shadows across the metal walls. The general's elongated skull gleamed as he leaned forward, his black eyes showing the same indifference they always held when discussing lesser species. "The humans," General Veltar said, his voice carrying the flat tone all Vellani used when stating obvious facts. A recently contacted species from the third planet of a small yellow star. They call their world Earth. Primitive technology, crude military doctrine, emotional decision-making processes. The Council granted them provisional membership 3 standard months ago. Zixthara nodded and scrolled through the basic information on his pad. The humans had achieved faster-than-light travel only 47 of their years ago, their longest. Space voyage had taken them barely 20 light years from their home system. By galactic standards, they were infants playing with tools they barely understood. "Why are we monitoring them?" Zixthara asked, though he already suspected the answer. The Council often used new species as testing grounds for their enemies. It was a cold but effective way to gauge threats while spending minimal resources. "The Skarn have begun moving through the Outer Rim territories again," General Veltar replied. "Intelligence suggests they will encounter human space within the next few weeks. The Council wants detailed observations of how the humans respond to a real military threat. The Skarn." Zixthara had observed them before, during their campaigns against the Delari colonies. They were efficient killers, using overwhelming numbers and brutal tactics to crush resistance quickly. Their ships were heavily armored, their weapons devastating, and their commanders showed no mercy to defeated enemies. Most species either surrendered immediately or died fighting hopeless battles. Expected outcome? Zixthara asked, though military. Protocol required him to ask even when the answer was obvious. Total human defeat within 72 hours of first contact, the general said without hesitation. Possibly sooner. Their fleet consists of 12 vessels, all using projectile weapons and primitive energy shields. The approaching Skarn force numbers over 200 ships. Zixthara made notes on his pad, calculating observation positions and recording equipment requirements. Standard monitoring doctrine called for maintaining a safe distance while gathering detailed tactical data. The information would be valuable for future Council operations, assuming any human survived to provide additional intelligence. "The human commander is someone called Jake Morrison," General Veltar continued. "Young by most species standards, approximately 35 Earth years. Limited combat experience, mostly against pirates and smugglers. He leads from a vessel they call the Endurance." The name struck Zixthara as odd. Most military vessels in the galaxy bore names that emphasized strength or power or victory. Endurance suggested something different, though he could not identify what that might be. Perhaps it reflected the primitive human understanding of warfare. "I will depart within 6 hours," Zixthara said, closing his datapad. "Standard monitoring protocols?" "Modified slightly," the general replied. "The Council is particularly interested in human psychological responses to overwhelming odds. Document their decision-making processes, communication patterns, and any unusual tactical choices. The data will help determine appropriate placement for survivors." Zixthara left the briefing room and walked through the sterile corridors of the station toward the docking bay where his observation ship waited. The vessel was a standard Valani design, built for stealth and equipped with the most advanced recording equipment in the galaxy. Its sensors could detect energy signatures from 3 star systems away, and its cloaking systems made it invisible to most known detection methods. As he prepared the ship for departure, Zixthara reviewed everything known about human physiology and psychology. They were carbon-based bipeds, similar to dozens of other species, but notably fragile. Their bones broke easily, their skin tore from minor impacts, and their internal organs were poorly protected. Most concerning was their apparently irrational emotional responses to stress and danger. The psychological profiles painted a picture of a species driven by feelings rather than logic. Humans formed strong emotional bonds with other individuals, often making tactical decisions based on protecting these bonds rather than achieving military objectives. They showed patterns of self-sacrifice that served no rational purpose, throwing away their lives for abstract concepts like honor or duty. Zixthara found such behavior disturbing. Velani military doctrine emphasized survival above all else. A dead soldier provided no future value to his civilization. Living soldiers could fight again, learn from mistakes, and contribute to long-term strategic goals. The human approach seemed wasteful and ultimately self-defeating. The journey to human space took 4 standard days. Zixthara spent the time reviewing tactical databases and preparing his observation equipment. He studied Skarn battle formations, documented their typical approaches to planetary assault, and calculated probable engagement zones based on the humans' known defensive positions. When he reached the edge of human territory, Zixthara was surprised by what he found. Instead of the scattered, panicked defensive positions he expected, the human fleet had formed a tight formation around something called Kepler Station. Their ships moved in coordinated patterns, maintaining formation discipline that suggested better training than their files indicated. Zixthara positioned his cloaked ship at optimal observation distance and activated his recording systems. The human vessels appeared crude compared to Council technology, with thick armor plating and weapon systems that seemed designed for close-range combat. Their formations suggested they intended to fight rather than flee, despite facing impossible odds. Through his sensors, Zixthara detected the approaching Skarn fleet. Over 200 vessels, arranged in their typical overwhelming assault formation. Their ships bristled with energy weapons and heavy armor, designed to crush resistance through pure firepower. Against 12 human vessels, the outcome seemed predetermined. Commander Morrison's ship, the Endurance, held position at the center of the human formation. Communications intercepts revealed calm, professional dialogue between human vessels, with none of the panic or desperation Zixthara expected from a doomed force. The commander's voice carried certainty rather than fear as he issued orders to his fleet. All ships maintain defensive positions around the station, Morrison's voice came through the communication channels. Civilian evacuation is proceeding on schedule. We hold the line until every last transport clears the jump point. Zixthara noted the reference to civilian evacuation. Standard military doctrine suggested abandoning non-essential personnel when facing overwhelming force, but the humans seemed determined to protect their civilians regardless of cost. It was another example of their emotional decision-making, overriding tactical logic. The Skarn fleet emerged from hyperspace in a flash of distorted light, their massive vessels blotting out the stars as they arranged themselves in attack formation. The lead ship, a heavily armed dreadnought, transmitted the standard Skarn surrender demand across all frequencies. Human vessels, you are outmatched and surrounded. The Skarn commander's voice boomed through space. Surrender immediately, and your deaths will be swift. Resist and your species will suffer prolonged extinction. Zixthara waited for the logical human response. Faced with such overwhelming force, any rational species would either surrender or attempt to negotiate terms. The tactical situation offered no possibility of victory, and continued resistance would only increase casualties. Commander Morrison's reply surprised him completely. Skarnfleet, this is Commander Jake Morrison of the Human Defense Force. The voice came back steady and defiant. I have one word for your surrender demand. No. The transmission ended, and the human fleet moved into attack formation. The battle began exactly as Zixthara expected it would end. The Skarn fleet moved forward in their standard formation, heavy dreadnoughts leading the assault, while smaller vessels spread out to prevent escape, their weapons charged with the distinctive whine that had marked the destruction of dozens of civilizations across the galaxy. What happened next defied every principle of warfare. Zixthara had studied in his centuries of military analysis. The human fleet did not retreat. They did not attempt to flee through hyperspace. Instead, Commander Morrison gave an order that made Zixthara check his translation systems for errors. All ships, attack Formation Delta. Target their lead vessels and punch through their center line. We make them pay for every meter. The 12 human ships accelerated directly toward the Skarn formation. Not in a desperate last charge, but in a coordinated assault that suggested they believed they could win. Zixthara watched in fascination as primitive human vessels opened fire with projectile weapons and crude energy cannons. Their shots focused on the largest enemy ships. The Skarn responded with overwhelming firepower. Energy beams lanced out from dozens of ships, striking human vessels and sending debris spinning through space. Zixthara expected the human formation to break apart under such punishment, but instead something impossible happened. When the human ship designated Valor took critical damage to its engines, instead of withdrawing for repairs, it accelerated directly toward the nearest Skarn cruiser. The ship's captain, someone called Amy Carter, according to intercepted communications, broadcast her intentions to the rest of the fleet. Valor to all ships. My engines are gone and life support is failing. I'm going to ram their cruiser. Make sure this counts for something. Zixthara watched in horror as the damaged human vessel slammed into the Skarn cruiser at full speed. Both ships exploded in a ball of superheated plasma, the destruction visible across several light minutes. But instead of demoralizing the remaining humans, the sacrifice seemed to energize them. Good hit, Amy, Commander Morrison's voice came. Across the communication channels, calm despite the chaos around him. All ships, continue the attack. Make her sacrifice count. The concept confused Zixthara completely. In Velani military doctrine, losing a ship and crew represented failure, something to be avoided at all costs. But the humans treated the loss as a tactical success, using the destroyed cruiser's absence to penetrate deeper into the Skarn formation. Another human ship, the Liberty, found itself surrounded by 3 Skarn vessels. Its captain, Ben Lewis, made a decision that violated every rule of military logic Zixthara knew. Instead of attempting to escape or calling for assistance, Lewis ordered his crew to overload their ship's reactor. Liberty to Fleet Command, we're about to go critical. Pulling the bastards in close so they come with us. The explosion that followed destroyed not just the Liberty, but all 3 surrounding Skarn ships. The humans had traded 1 vessel for 3 enemy ships, but the cost in trained personnel seemed enormous. Yet the remaining human ships continued fighting with no apparent concern for these losses. Zixthara began documenting behavior patterns that challenged everything he thought he knew about warfare. The humans were making tactical decisions that prioritized mission objectives over crew survival. When the ship Courage suffered hull breaches that should have forced withdrawal, its crew sealed themselves into their battle stations and continued fighting until their life support failed. But the most disturbing aspect was how systematically the humans approached these sacrifices. They were not panicked decisions made in desperation. Each crew that chose death did so after careful calculation, maximizing the damage their sacrifice would inflict on the enemy. Captain Lisa Parks of the Determination demonstrated this when her ship lost main weapons power. Instead of withdrawing, she maneuvered close to a Skarn dreadnought and launched her entire crew in boarding pods. Determination crew to fleet. Our weapons are dead, but we're not. Boarding the enemy flagship. If we can take their bridge, we can disrupt their entire formation. Zix Thara watched through his sensors as 37 humans in primitive spacesuits forced their way into a ship designed to carry 3,000 Skarn warriors. The humans fought through the corridors with handheld weapons, advancing toward the bridge despite overwhelming odds. They never reached their target. The Skarn eventually overwhelmed them through sheer numbers. But their boarding action disrupted the dreadnought's command systems for crucial minutes, allowing other human ships to target its exposed weapon arrays. What made the sacrifice even more disturbing was how the other humans responded. Instead of mourning their lost comrades, they immediately exploited the tactical opportunity the boarding party had created. The human ship Resilience used the confusion to destroy the dreadnought's main engines, crippling the massive vessel Dot. As the battle continued, Zix Thara observed a pattern that chilled him to his core. The humans were learning. Each sacrifice taught them something new about Skarn tactics and technology. They adapted their strategies in real time, incorporating lessons written in the blood of their own people. When the Skarn tried to use their superior numbers to surround individual human ships, Commander Morrison developed a counter-tactic that involved deliberate self-destruction. Human vessels would allow themselves to be surrounded, then detonate their reactors in coordinated sequences that created gaps in the enemy formation. All ships, new tactical protocol, Morrison's voice carried across the fleet. If you find yourself surrounded by more than 2 enemy vessels, go critical and take them with you. Every gap we create gives the others a better shot. The orders were followed without question. Human crews accepted death assignments with the same professional calm they might show when receiving routine patrol duties. Zix Thara realized he was witnessing a form of warfare that treated individual lives as expendable tactical resources. The battle reached its climax when Commander Morrison himself made the ultimate sacrifice. The Endurance had taken severe damage and was losing power to its weapon systems. A group of Skarn cruisers moved in to finish the flagship, which would have ended human resistance. Morrison's response was to ram his ship directly into the largest Skarn vessel. This is Commander Morrison to all surviving ships. His final transmission began. I'm going to take out their command ship. Captain Rodriguez, you have command of the fleet. Get our people out of here. The Endurance exploded against the Skarn flagship in a burst of light that outshone the nearby star. Both vessels disintegrated instantly, taking with them over 4,000 lives. But the destruction of the Skarn command ship threw their remaining forces into confusion. The surviving human vessels, now reduced to just 3 ships, used that confusion to complete their primary mission. The civilian evacuation transports that had been loading refugees from Kepler Station jumped to hyperspace, carrying thousands of human non-combatants to safety. When the battle ended, Zix Thara stared at his tactical displays in shock. The human fleet had been completely destroyed. Every ship, every crew, everyone who had chosen to fight was dead. By any rational measure, they had suffered total defeat. But they had also destroyed 63 Skarn vessels and saved every civilian they had sworn to protect. The Skarn fleet, though victorious, was badly damaged and forced to withdraw for repairs. What should have been a quick conquest had become a costly victory that left the enemy weakened. Zix Thara found himself disturbed by a realization that violated his understanding of military logic. The humans had lost the battle. But Somehow they had also won it. They had achieved their objectives through methods that prioritized success over survival. As he prepared his initial report, Zixthara struggled to find words that could convey what he had witnessed. The humans had demonstrated a form of warfare that was both primitive and terrifyingly effective. They fought not just to win, but to ensure that victory came at such a cost that their enemies would hesitate to fight them again. The most troubling aspect was that this appeared to be deliberate strategy rather than desperate improvisation. The humans had chosen to fight this way, embracing death as a tactical tool rather than an outcome to be avoided. Zixthara realized that his monitoring assignment had become something much more significant. He was not just observing the defeat of another primitive species. He was documenting the emergence of a form of warfare that could change the balance of power across the galaxy. 3 weeks after the battle at Kepler Station, Zixthara found himself questioning his own sanity. Logic demanded that he return to Velani space and file his report on humanity's inevitable extinction. The species had lost their entire fleet, their most experienced commander, and faced an enemy that still outnumbered them by hundreds of ships. Any rational analysis pointed to swift defeat and probable genocide. Instead, Zixthara maintained his position in human space, watching something that defied every principle of military science he had studied. The humans were not surrendering. They were not fleeing to remote systems to hide from Skarn vengeance. They were preparing to fight again. New Geneva Station orbited a gas giant in the inner human territories, serving as their primary military headquarters. Zixthara positioned his cloaked ship among the asteroid fields nearby, close enough to monitor human communications and troop movements. What he observed challenged his understanding of how civilized species responded to devastating military defeat. The station buzzed with activity as surviving human forces regrouped. Ships arrived daily from across human space, not carrying refugees fleeing the war, but volunteers coming to join it. Cargo vessels brought weapons and supplies. Transport ships delivered fresh crews to replace the thousands who had died at Kepler Station. Most disturbing was the attitude of the humans themselves. Zixthara monitored their communications and found no trace of the despair or panic he expected from a defeated species. Instead, human voices carried determination and something that translated roughly as anger. They spoke of their dead comrades, not with grief, but with resolve to make their sacrifices meaningful. Commander Nick Rodriguez had assumed overall command of human forces after Morrison's death. Zixthara studied the man's psychological profile with growing unease. Rodriguez was younger than Morrison, with even less combat experience, yet he displayed the same disturbing willingness to embrace catastrophic casualties in pursuit of military objectives. "We knew this would be costly," Rodriguez said during a command briefing that Zixthara intercepted. Jake Morrison and 3,000 others proved that humans can hurt the Skarn badly enough to make them think twice. Now we build on that foundation. Briefing continued with tactical discussions that made Zixthara realize the humans had learned far more from the Kepler Station battle than he had expected. They analyzed every aspect of the engagement, studying their own destruction with the cold efficiency of professional soldiers. Captain Lisa Parks, one of the few survivors from the first battle, presented detailed analysis of Skarn ship designs and tactical doctrines. Her report was based on observations made while watching her comrades die, but she delivered it with scientific precision. Skarn energy shields are strongest at the front and weakest at the engine sections, Parks explained. Our ramming attacks were most effective when we targeted their rear quarters. I recommend modifying our ship designs to maximize ramming damage rather than defensive capabilities. Zixthara paused his recording to process what he had heard. The humans were not just accepting suicidal tactics as necessary evils. They were refining them into military doctrine. They studied the most effective methods for sacrificing their own forces to inflict maximum damage on their enemies. The modifications Parks suggested were implemented within days. Human shipyards worked around the clock to retrofit their remaining vessels with reinforced prows and overcharged reactor systems designed to create more powerful explosions. They were literally rebuilding their fleet to be more effective at destroying itself. But the changes went deeper than hardware modifications. Zixthara monitored training exercises where human crews practiced coordination for suicide missions. They ran simulations of ramming attacks, reactor overloads, and boarding actions where survival was not even considered as a possibility. New tactical doctrines emerged from these exercises. Human ships began operating in what they called expendable formations, where each vessel was paired with specific enemy targets and prepared to trade their lives for maximum strategic impact. Crews volunteered for assignments based on which form of death would best serve their cause. The second major engagement came sooner than expected. Skarn intelligence had apparently identified New Geneva Station as a priority target, and a battle group of 30 ships moved to destroy it. Against this force, the humans could deploy only 5 vessels, all of them carrying crews trained in the new suicidal tactics. Zixthara positioned himself closer to the battle zone this time, his scientific curiosity overriding normal safety protocols. He needed to understand how human warfare had evolved since the first engagement. The battle began with the Skarn demand for surrender, just as before. Commander Rodriguez's response was broadcast across all frequencies with calm professionalism. Skarn forces, this is Commander Rodriguez of the Human Defense Fleet. We have 5 ships against your 30. Mathematics suggests we are badly outnumbered. Mathematics has never met humans before. What followed was unlike anything in Zixthara's database of recorded battles. The human ships moved with coordinated precision, each crew executing maneuvers that guaranteed their destruction while maximizing damage to specific enemy targets. Captain Danny Cooper of the ship Vengeance led his vessel directly into the Skarn formation, drawing fire from multiple enemy ships. But instead of simply ramming the nearest target, Cooper waited until his ship was surrounded, then triggered a reactor overload that destroyed 6 Skarn vessels simultaneously. Vengeance to fleet. Cooper's final transmission came through clearly. Multiple targets acquired. Going critical in 3, 2, 1. Make it count, people. The explosion lit up the battlefield like a miniature star, and the human fleet immediately exploited the gap in the enemy formation. Captain Sally Brooks maneuvered her ship Retribution through the debris field, using the wreckage as cover to approach a Skarn heavy cruiser. Brooks had trained her crew in close-quarters boarding tactics, specifically designed for suicide missions. When Retribution reached the enemy ship, her entire crew abandoned their vessel and forced their way aboard the Skarn cruiser. Their objective was not to capture the ship, but to sabotage its reactor core from the inside. Zixthara watched through his sensors as 37 humans fought through a ship designed to carry over 1,000 enemy soldiers. They advanced methodically toward the engineering sections, leaving explosive charges at key structural points as they progressed deeper into the vessel. The humans never expected to survive their mission, and they did not. Skarn defenders eventually overwhelmed them through sheer numbers. But they had accomplished their objective. The cruiser's reactor went critical 15 minutes after the boarding action began, taking 2 nearby Skarn ships with it in the explosion. The pattern continued throughout the battle. Each human ship targeted specific enemy vessels and used the most effective suicidal tactic to destroy them. Captain Lisa Parks led a ramming attack that split a Skarn dreadnought in half. Lieutenant Maria Santos flew her damaged fighter into the bridge of the enemy flagship, decapitating their command structure. By the battle's end, all 5 human ships had been destroyed. Every human who chose to fight was dead. but they had eliminated 28 of the 30 Skarn vessels, forcing the survivors to retreat in confusion. Zixthara realized he was witnessing the emergence of something unprecedented in Galactic warfare. The humans had developed tactical doctrines that treated death not as a failure to be avoided, but as a resource to be efficiently utilized. They calculated casualties the way other species calculated ammunition expenditure, but the most disturbing aspect was how quickly human society had adapted to support this form of warfare. Zixthara monitored communications from Earth and discovered that the entire human species had mobilized for what they called total war. Their planet's entire industrial capacity was devoted to producing ships and weapons designed for single use destruction. Human civilians spoke of military service with the same matter-of-fact acceptance that other species reserved for routine jobs. Young humans volunteered for duty, knowing they would likely die, and their families supported these decisions without apparent emotional distress. The psychological profiles made no sense according to standard xenological theory. Humans should have been devastated by such massive casualties. Their society should have collapsed under the weight of continuous sacrifice. Instead, they seemed to draw strength from their losses, using each death as motivation for greater commitment to the war effort. Zixthara found himself monitoring human cultural transmissions, trying to understand how an entire species could embrace such costly tactics. Human entertainment media celebrated sacrifice and duty above individual survival. Their historical records were filled with examples of military forces choosing death over defeat. It became clear that what Zixthara was observing was not an aberration caused by desperate circumstances. This was how humans naturally approached warfare when their survival was threatened. They had been preparing for this kind of conflict for their entire evolutionary history. 2 months into his observation mission, Zixthara began experiencing what human medical texts would have called psychological breakdown. The Valani nervous system was not designed to process the constant cognitive dissonance of watching an entire species embrace death as military doctrine. Every engagement he witnessed challenged fundamental assumptions about rational behavior that had guided his species for millennia. The Battle of Proxima Gate became the turning point in Zixthara's understanding of human warfare. The engagement began as a routine Skarn raid against a human mining operation, but evolved into something that violated every principle of military logic he had ever studied. Commander Rodriguez had positioned a small fleet of 8 ships to defend 3 civilian convoy routes that converged at the Proxima system. Intelligence suggested the Skarn would attack with overwhelming force, making evacuation the only rational response. Instead, Rodriguez chose to fight a delaying action that would save the convoys at the cost of his entire fleet. All ships maintained defensive positions around the jump points. Rodriguez's voice carried the same calm professionalism that Zixthara had learned to associate with human death sentences. Civilian transports have priority. We hold until every last ship clears the system. Zixthara monitored the tactical situation with growing dread. The approaching Skarn force numbered 47 ships, including several heavy dreadnoughts designed for planetary bombardment. Against this armada, 8 human vessels prepared to sacrifice themselves with the methodical precision of a religious ritual. Captain Nick Torres of the ship Defiance opened the engagement by leading his vessel directly into the center of the Skarn formation. His crew had spent weeks preparing for this moment, modifying their ship's reactor to produce the most destructive explosion possible when overloaded. Defiance to fleet, beginning my run, Torres transmitted as enemy fire began tearing apart his ship's hull. Tell my kids their father died buying them a future. The explosion destroyed 6 Skarn vessels and created a gap in their formation. That allowed the first civilian convoy to escape to hyperspace. Torres and his crew of 43 died instantly, but their sacrifice saved over 2,000 non-combatants. What disturbed Zixthara most was how efficiently the other human commanders exploited Torres's death. Captain Maria Gonzalez immediately moved her ship Honor into position to protect the second convoy, while Captain Steve Johnson prepared Liberty for another reactor overload sequence. The humans had learned to coordinate their suicides with tactical precision. Each death served multiple purposes, creating opportunities for the next sacrifice while advancing their overall strategic objectives. They treated their own lives as ammunition to be expended at maximum efficiency. Captain Johnson's sacrifice followed 15 minutes later, destroying 8 more Skarn ships while clearing the escape route for the second convoy. His final transmission demonstrated the disturbing evolution of human military thinking. Liberty going critical in 30 seconds, Johnson announced calmly. I've got good targeting solutions on their heavy cruisers. This should hurt them badly enough to slow their advance. Zixthara realized that Johnson was not just dying for his cause. He was analyzing his own death in real time, calculating how to maximize its tactical impact. The psychological implications horrified the Villani observer. The pattern continued. Throughout the engagement, Captain Lisa Rodriguez led a boarding action against a Skarn dreadnought, knowing her crew would never return. Lieutenant Danny Walsh flew his fighter into the enemy flagship's bridge. Major Kelly Brown detonated her transport's cargo hold while surrounded by enemy vessels. Each death was precisely calculated for maximum strategic benefit. The humans had developed detailed databases cataloging the most effective methods for killing themselves while inflicting optimal damage on their enemies. They studied suicide tactics with the same scientific rigor other species devoted to defensive strategies. But the aftermath of the battle revealed something even more disturbing. The 3 civilian convoys that escaped carried detailed records of every human death, complete with tactical analysis and recommendations for improving future suicide missions. Zixthara intercepted communications from the lead transport, where convoy commander Captain Sarah Lee compiled what she called a sacrifice effectiveness report. The document treated human deaths as data points in a larger strategic analysis. Torres's reactor overload achieved optimal spread pattern against enemy heavy units. Lee's report noted with clinical detachment. Recommend modifying future overload sequences to match his tactical approach. Johnson's targeting solutions were exceptional. His sacrifice should be studied by all fleet personnel. The report continued with detailed technical analysis of how each human had died, including recommendations for making future sacrifices more effective. The humans were not just accepting death as inevitable. They were working to perfect it as a weapon system. Zixthara found himself monitoring human communications from across their territory, trying to understand how an entire civilization could function with such attitudes toward mortality. What he discovered challenged everything he thought he knew about psychological limits and social cohesion. Human families celebrated the deaths of their military members as achievements rather than tragedies. Parents whose children died in suicide attacks received recognition from their communities for raising successful warriors. Spouses of deceased personnel remarried with the explicit goal of producing more soldiers for future conflicts. Educational systems on human worlds began incorporating tactical sacrifice into their military curricula. Children learned mathematics by calculating optimal casualty ratios. They studied history through the lens of famous last stands and successful suicide missions. Most disturbing was the discovery that human religious and philosophical systems had evolved to support their military practices. Traditional concepts of individual self-preservation were being replaced by doctrines that emphasized service to the species above personal survival. Zixthara monitored a human military academy where cadets took formal oaths pledging to die effectively for their cause. The ceremony was treated as a celebration rather than a funeral, with families attending to witness their children's commitment to sacrifice. "I swear to give my life in service to humanity," the cadets recited in unison. "I will die with purpose, achieving maximum tactical benefit from my sacrifice. My death will serve the future of my species." The psychological transformation was complete. Humans had restructured their entire civilization around the principle that individual lives existed to be expended in service of larger strategic goals. They had weaponized their own mortality, but the true horror emerged when Zixtara realized that this transformation was working. Human casualties were enormous, but they were achieving their military objectives through sheer willingness to pay any price for victory. The Skarn were beginning to show signs of strategic hesitation. Intercepted enemy communications revealed growing concern about human fanatical resistance and irrational tactical choices. Skarn commanders were requesting additional forces before engaging human positions, acknowledging that victories against humans came at unexpectedly high costs. The psychological impact on enemy morale was becoming a strategic factor. Skarn crews who survived encounters with human forces showed symptoms of what their medical personnel termed combat stress syndrome. They had difficulty processing encounters with opponents who seemed to prefer death over defeat. Zixtara documented cases where entire Skarn units refused engagement orders rather than face human suicide tactics. Enemy commanders were being forced to rotate crews away from human sectors to prevent psychological breakdown among their forces. Humans had discovered something that violated fundamental assumptions about warfare. They had learned that opponents willing to die completely could defeat technologically superior enemies through psychological warfare. Fear of human sacrifice tactics was becoming as effective as the tactics themselves. But the most chilling aspect was how systematically the humans were scaling up their approach. Zixtara intercepted communications indicating that Earth's entire industrial capacity was being reorganized around supporting sacrifice-based warfare. They were building ships designed specifically for single-use destruction, training crews exclusively for suicide missions, and developing weapon systems that maximized posthumous damage. The human species was transforming itself into a civilization scale weapon system with every individual component designed to be expended in service of strategic objectives. They were becoming something unprecedented in galactic history, a species that had weaponized its own extinction instinct. As Zixtara prepared another report for his commanding officers, he struggled with a growing realization that terrified him. The humans were not just winning individual battles through suicidal tactics. They were fundamentally changing the nature of warfare itself. Any species that fought humans would be forced to either match their willingness to die or face inevitable defeat. The implications for galactic civilization were staggering. The humans had discovered a form of warfare that could force evolutionary changes in every species they encountered. The final battle took place at Armstrong Base, humanity's last major stronghold in the Outer Territories. Zixtara had been monitoring human preparations for 3 weeks, watching them transform a routine military installation into something that defied every principle of defensive architecture he understood. The humans were not building fortifications designed to protect their forces. They were creating an elaborate suicide weapon. Commander Rodriguez now led fewer than 30 ships, all that remained of humanity's once proud fleet. Against this pathetic force, the Skarn had assembled their largest armada yet, over 400 vessels including their newest dreadnoughts and planet-killer ships. Any rational analysis suggested this would be humanity's final defeat, the end of their brief and violent entry into galactic politics. Zixtara positioned his cloaked observation ship closer than ever before, drawn by a compulsion he could know: longer control. 3 months of watching human warfare had fundamentally altered his psychological state. He needed to witness the end of this species that had violated every assumption about civilized behavior. Armstrong base orbited a dead planet, in a system with no strategic value except its position along major hyperspace routes. The installation itself appeared unremarkable. Standard defensive platforms, weapons arrays, and docking facilities designed to support a few dozen ships. But Zixthara S sensors detected modifications that made no tactical sense. Every structure on the base had been fitted with explosive charges, far exceeding anything needed for self-destruction. The reactor cores of parked ships had been linked together in a network that could trigger simultaneous overloads. Even the asteroid field surrounding the base had been mined with devices that could turn each rock into a guided projectile. Humans had spent months preparing Armstrong Base not to be defended, but to be destroyed in the most devastating way possible. They had transformed their last stronghold into a trap designed to maximize the cost of their own defeat. Base Commander Chris Taylor transmitted a message to the approaching Skarn fleet that Zixthara intercepted and analyzed with growing dread. The communication revealed the final evolution of human military thinking. Skarn forces, this is Commander Taylor of Armstrong Base. The message began with the matter-of-fact tone humans used when discussing mass suicide. You have come to finish what you started at Kepler Station. We welcome you to try. But understand that humans have learned much about dying since we first met you in battle. The Skarn fleet commander responded with a standard demand for surrender, but his voice carried uncertainty that had not been present in earlier engagements. 3 months of fighting humans had taught the Skarn to fear their enemy's willingness to embrace death. Human forces, you are completely outnumbered and surrounded, the Skarn transmission declared. Surrender now, and some of your people may be allowed to survive as slaves. Continue to resist, and your entire species will be exterminated. Commander Taylor's reply demonstrated how thoroughly human psychology had adapted to their suicidal military. Doctrine. Skarn Commander, we have 30 ships against your 400. By any reasonable calculation, you should be able to destroy us easily. But humans stopped being reasonable the day you invaded our space. Let me show you what we learned about unreasonable warfare. The battle began with what appeared to be a conventional human suicide charge. Rodriguez led his fleet directly toward the Skarn formation, following the same tactics that had characterized every previous engagement. But Zixthara S sensors detected something different in the energy signatures of the human ships. The vessels were not just prepared for reactor overloads. They had been modified into guided bombs, their hulls packed with experimental explosives that would trigger secondary detonations in nearby ships. The humans had turned their entire fleet into a chain reaction weapon designed to propagate destruction. Throughout the enemy formation, not Captain Maria Santos of the ship, Determination, led the first wave of attacks, her vessel loaded with enough explosive material to destroy a small moon. But instead of simply ramming the nearest enemy ship, Santos maneuvered her vessel into the exact center of the Skarn fleet before triggering detonation. Determination to base, Santos transmitted as enemy fire tore her ship apart. I'm in optimal position for maximum cascade effect. Tell my daughter that Mommy died making the bad people go away. The explosion that followed exceeded anything Zixthara had recorded in his databases. Santos's ship disintegrated in a ball of energy that triggered sympathetic detonations in 17 Skarn vessels. The chain reaction continued as burning. Wreckage struck additional ships, spreading destruction through the enemy formation like a plague. But the human fleet had only begun, demonstrating their new tactical doctrines. Captain Danny Walsh led a squadron of fighters modified to penetrate enemy shields through sustained suicide attacks. Each pilot flew directly into Skarn weapon emplacements, using their deaths to create gaps in the enemy's defensive systems. Fighter. Squadron to base. Walsh transmitted as his ship's hull began to melt under enemy fire. "We're punching holes in their shields, sending you targeting data for the big surprise." The targeting data was relayed to Armstrong Base, where Commander Taylor had been waiting for the optimal moment to spring his trap. The base itself was the ultimate expression of human sacrifice tactics, a weapon system designed to destroy everything within 3 light minutes when triggered. Zix Thara watched in horror as Taylor began the detonation sequence that would obliterate Armstrong Base along with everything nearby. The human commander's final transmission revealed the true depths of their species' commitment to victory through death. "All ships, this is Taylor. The base is going critical in 60 seconds. Any human vessel still in the blast radius when that happens dies with us. I suggest you make these final moments count." The remaining human ships used those 60 seconds to position themselves among the largest concentrations of enemy vessels. They calculated their deaths with mathematical precision, ensuring maximum casualties when the base exploded. Lieutenant Lisa Brooks flew her fighter directly into the bridge of the Skarn flagship, decapitating their command structure at the moment Taylor triggered the base's destruction. Captain Steve Johnson rammed his cruiser into the enemy's main ammunition ship, creating a secondary explosion that propagated through their formation. When Armstrong Base detonated, the blast consumed everything within its range: human ships, Skarn vessels, asteroids, and the installation itself. The explosion was visible from neighboring star systems, a monument to humanity's willingness to pay any price for victory. Zix Thara's sensors recorded the aftermath with mechanical precision, while his mind struggled to process what he had witnessed. The humans had achieved total victory through total annihilation. Of the 400 Skarn ships that had attacked Armstrong Base, only 11 survived the engagement. But every human defender was dead. The strategic implications were staggering. The Skarn fleet that had terrorized the outer territories for months was effectively destroyed. Their invasion of human space was over, ended by a species that had discovered victory through extinction. But as Zix Thara prepared his final report, he intercepted communications from Earth that revealed the true horror of what he had witnessed. The battle at Armstrong Base was not humanity's last stand. It was their opening move. Human transmissions revealed that Earth had been building new fleets throughout the war. Vessels designed specifically for the sacrifice tactics they had perfected through months of combat. Thousands of ships waded in. Hidden bases throughout human space, crewed by volunteers trained exclusively in suicide warfare. More disturbing were the communications from human colonies, worlds that had embraced the same militaristic transformation that had consumed their home planet. Entire civilizations were reorganizing themselves around the principle that individual survival was less important than species victory. Realized that he had not been witnessing the end of human civilization. He had been documenting its metamorphosis into something unprecedented in galactic history, a species that had weaponized its own mortality and then found strength in systematic self-destruction. The psychological profiles made horrible sense now. Humans had not developed their suicidal tactics out of desperation or primitive thinking. They had discovered that opponents willing to die completely could defeat any enemy, no matter how technologically advanced or numerically superior. As Zix Thara transmitted his final observations to Valani Command, he included a warning that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The humans had learned that death was the ultimate weapon, and they wielded it with terrifying joy. In his last intercepted transmission from the ruins of Armstrong Base, Commander Taylor's voice had carried something that chilled Zix Thara to his core, not resignation or despair, but satisfaction. The humans had enjoyed their victory, even though it cost them everything. They had found in warfare not just duty or necessity, but purpose. And now they were coming for the rest of the galaxy.